So when you think about what evolution is, you think firstly about what is the definition. And the definition is a little bit slippery. So here's a biology textbook commonly found in high schools across the nation. It says that evolution is change over time. Now, I change over time. I get a little fatter here, get a little dumber there. You know, my joints ache a little more. Am I evolving? Well, I'm changing over time. Children change over time. They start out as infants and they grow rather quickly. Is that evolution? Evolution is change over time. And it is the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. And here we have this idea of descent from a common ancestor, a descent with modification, what's called a phylogenetic relationship, a biological genetic relationship through time. Evolution is a scientific theory that uses upward change by common descent that was demonstrated in the fossil record over long periods of time. Okay, so now we're using the fossil record through the glasses of our naturalistic field of view to say that that supports this change over time. Another definition comes from the Oxford Concise Science Dictionary. Evolution, the gradual process by which the present diversity of plant and animal life arose from the earliest and most primitive organisms, which is believed to have been continuing for the past 3,000 million years. That's 3 billion years. It's quite a long time. And of course, on the right is the amoeba to man kind of a scenario. This is macroevolutionary change. This is large-scale change from common ancestors over time diverging one from another by genetic change, natural selection, environmental changes to create all the diversity that we see in the world around us. Collins' dictionary says, evolution, the origination of species by development from earlier, quote, simpler forms of life over millions of years by the process of natural selection and or mutation. Okay, pretty standard sort of a ballpark definition. These are honestly not the kind of definitions that professional scientists use for evolution and or people who actually are in the field, but it serves as a general introductory kind of a definition for people thinking about evolution and thinking about macroevolutionary change through time. The definition of microevolution is a bit different, and this is more of the updated definition. This is from the Curtis textbook called Biology, 1989 edition. Evolution can be precisely defined as any change in the frequency of alleles within a gene pool from one generation to the next. So do you notice how this definition has gone from a large-scale definition to a very, very small microscopic definition in terms of genetic changes? Alleles are different genetic forms of particular character traits in the DNA. And if the frequency of particular alleles changes in the individuals in a population, that now becomes the definition of evolution. And you see how that can be kind of a more broad definition, because you can certainly see how a couple of a bird species might have within its population slightly different color variations in its wings or body, or different feather types, and that over time with breeding isolation, these two different birds can become slightly different variants from one another. And if that is accompanied by a change in a frequency of a particular genetic allele, that by definition now becomes evolution. And so instead of requiring that there be massive changes in kinds of organisms, this definition accepts very, very tiny, minuscule, and even inconsequential changes as evidence of evolution, but it's called microevolution. Now, microevolution doesn't mean that the organisms that experience it are small. It means that the changes within the organism's genetics are quite small, and that microevolution happens within populations of organisms, not between populations of organisms. So this diagram looks at, on the left, a bug on a leaf. Lots of different kinds of bugs, lots of different populations. They come out various times in the year. One may have a different size, different color, different abilities to eat various trees or plants, various ways of breeding. Those changes within the population are considered microevolution. Now, in macroevolution, the thinking is that the mechanism of macroevolution is exactly the same as microevolution, except that those changes accumulate through time. So they have the same mechanism, but a different scale of effect through time. And this just shows a theoretical dinosaur sort of evolution. Crossing species and kind of organism boundaries to allow organisms to morph or change into completely different kinds of organisms. So get that in your mind. We're talking about two different levels of effects, but from the same kind of genetic change. One is very easily seen. The other actually is an extrapolation from this small effect. Well, this idea of evolution is a very, very old idea. It didn't start with Darwin. And I don't want to give a whole history lesson on Darwin, but here's one slide summary of Darwin and his history. But really, evolutionary ideas go back to the Greeks. They go back certainly to Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus, who had similar kinds of ideas as he did. But there were people around Darwin that fed him various ideas during the late 1800s. That were being developed at the time and that he was the recipient of. He spent about 5 years on a voyage on the ship called the Beagle, going around the world collecting specimens and making observations. Most of his observations were geological, not biological. In fact, when he got back, he sent many of his specimens out to be looked at by other people. And he spent about 20 years after he got back developing his ideas and doing analyses of the specimens that he brought back, and developing this idea of evolution by natural selection. But these people who were around him, at least in the same time frame, Charles Lyell was a geologist whose book on uniformitarian geology, the captain of the Beagle actually gave to Darwin to read during the voyage. And so that idea that the present is the key to the past was something that Darwin read as he was on the voyage. Thomas Malthus was not a biologist, but he did population studies, and he basically came up with the idea that over time populations will outgrow mathematically their food supply. So there's going to be a struggle for that food. There's going to be a competition for that food. About that time, people were also digging down in rocks and finding out that the rocks had layers and there were different kinds of organisms at different layers. And Cuvier made the observation that a lot of those never made it to the present, that they were apparent in these rock layers, and if those are sequentially laid down with the youngest on top, that these animals now had become extinct because we don't see their counterparts in the natural world today. So there was life in the past that didn't make it to the present, if that record is a record of time and change through time. And Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck had these ideas of how do animals change? Do they change by stretching the neck like a giraffe would do, or running fast as a cheetah would do? If one cheetah could run faster than another, then maybe those fast genes would get passed on to the next generation, and they would be even faster. Whatever would be an acquired characteristic during its lifetime could be passed on to the next generation. If an animal developed big muscles while it was alive, then the big muscles should be passed on to the next generation. Well, it turns out that that's not the way it works, of course, but those ideas of change through time, of long periods of time, of competition for food through time, are the key basics for the ideas of Darwinian evolution. And by the time Darwin had a chance to get his thoughts together after about 20 years, Alfred Russel Wallace was ready to publish on those same ideas. And so Darwin actually arranged for them to co-present a paper 2 years before the Origin of the Species was published, out of respect for the fact that he had come up with similar ideas, and then Darwin went on to publish The Origin of the Species. So I have a couple of notes at the bottom there of barnacles and beetles, because outside of his studies on his specimens from the Galapagos and around the world and the Beagle voyage, Darwin also wrote very impressive studies of barnacles and beetles. Now, beetles are fascinating. Barnacles I'm not so sure about, but he really became an authority on those subjects. Edward Blyth is a little bit of a different story. He wrote a couple of articles, 2 or 3 articles in a journal a number of years before Darwin in 1835 to 1837. And those articles actually mentioned the idea of natural selection. And so these ideas were not new to Darwin. They were all sort of fed into him as someone who could crystallize those ideas and move forward with them. And the fact that he waited 20 years is a testament to the fact that he was apprehensive about what those ideas would mean within the religious kind of an environment in his day. But he did have 4 basic concepts in Darwinian evolution. The first concept is that there is variation within species. Different size, coloration, different behavioral patterns. There are lots and lots of variation. And he observed that as he went around the world. The second one is that there is some mechanism for inheritance of favorable characteristics. Now, Darwin didn't know what that was because he wasn't aware of the work of Mendel. Mendel, as an Austrian priest, had been doing his work and had published it in a really obscure journal, which didn't get rediscovered for almost 40 years. And so Darwin knew that there had to be some method of characteristics getting transferred from one generation to another. You just know that based on you're different than your children, but your children are similar than you. I mean, there's got to be something that would link you to your children that would pass on certain characteristics. He just didn't know what that mechanism was. Mendel had an idea, but had Darwin had more of an idea what that mechanism was, he might have changed his theory, as a matter of fact. The third characteristic is that there is a struggle for existence because populations expand beyond their food supply. Life is ready to expand and to grow, oftentimes exponentially. When there's enough for it to eat, the right conditions, animals and other organisms will just explode in terms of their population. And that creates a limiting factor when whatever it is that they eat is now in short supply because it's been consumed by that growing population. And so then they have a struggle for existence. Who survives? Whether it's dry weather, lack of prey, heat, whatever it is, there's a struggle to maintain the individual within a population that is food restricted. The fourth concept is that of natural selection. And this is a concept, not a real entity, if you will. Natural selection as a concept acts to select the best adapted or best fit individuals for a given environment. Okay, so Darwin never said, survival of the fittest. He did talk about survival of those who are more fit. That is, that they are better adapted for a particular environment. And what will they do? They will survive to leave offspring, and they'll leave more offspring than an organism that is not as well fit. So natural selection is nothing more than a differential reproductive capability within a particular environment. It's not a physical filter that, for instance, some animals need to go through. But what would happen if all 4 of these concepts were true? Because they are true. There's variation within species. There is a mechanism for inheritance of characteristics. It's genetics, it's DNA, it's chromosomal, it's well known. There is a struggle for existence in populations under limiting food supply, and natural selection is a real process. It does actually occur. It's very well documented. Very easy to document, as a matter of fact, that differential survival and reproduction does occur. So if all 4 of those things are true, does that mean that evolution is true? Well, the answer is no. But we need to look a little bit deeper to understand why.